A girl. A bloody girl. Steeper's outrage was loud enough to bring the cats and dogs out of the thatch over the stables. He had been raging about this for the rest of the afternoon. Utid rolled his eyes as they began to polish the armor. Any day now, and Alfred would be ordering them to London to fight the very brothers Utid had failed to kill in Cumbraland. They had regrouped in Francia and were threatening to choke the Thames, Alfred's trading lifeblood. "You mean you didn't know, big man?" Finan made to wind up Steeper as was his usual style, but his words felt flat as Alfred's head guard thrust a score of spears at the Irishman. "She is female." Why was this a surprise? Miral put in, suggesting Steeper implied it as a slight towards him. Odda knew, our guards knew. He nearly said that the Lady Mildred knew, but knew enough and liked his teeth too much to say that in front of Utid. Why is this only a problem in Wessex? 88,888,888. Later that day, Miral got his heart's desire, permission to march to meet his lord and move to the Merson household guard, Elfka too, with several of Lord Ethelred's men left behind in Winchester for the wedding and were needed at Aylesbury for training. There was going to be an offensive on London, and reclaim it, ostensibly for Mercia, but in practicality, for a so-called Wessex-Mercia Union. But for Osrith, her days since trying to rescue Edward were almost artificially quiet, and she was almost relieved when Steeper summoned her to the king's presence. "I will get straight to the point," King Alfred said, his voice quieter than Osrith remembered. Beside him, Lady Ellsworth, with a strange, awkward look on her face. "You have the rest of the day to get affairs in order." "Is my work poor, Lord King?" She saw Alfred start at her directness, and Ellsworth was glaring at her. "The Atheling is to be tutored, and Steeper can manage his sword training. Like your Scottish lord, Edward is also grown." He gave her an odd look, and it struck Osrith that he appeared so unlike the Alfred she had seen daily, commanding and organizing. Almost apologetic. "You have worked well with my son, and I am pleased with your service." The finality of his sentence might have stilled most people, but Osrith was nothing if not hot-headed at an injustice. "Then why?" she pressed. "Lord King, you said yourself, my training of him has been exceptional." "Because the Atheling can never be who he needs to be while you train him." It was not the king who had spoken. Beside him, in the gloom, her brother stepped forward. It was his words that confronted Osrith's directness with his own. Utid took a step back, and the king looked back to her. "The Lord Utid will supervise the Atheling from now on. You are to leave the kingdom. I have sent word to the Lord Ethelred. Your guard cell has gone north with the Mercian army, has it not?" He looked across to Steeper. His usually impassive face was one of silent fury, directed entirely at Osrith. "Indeed, my lord," Steeper replied, slowly. Miral had taken the men Odda had had in his army, and his commander, Aldhelm, had accepted their pledges to Lord Ethelred. "You should be pleased," went on her brother. "You have a place in an army, which will keep you." Pleased? Why was she to be pleased? She wished to be in Wessex, and the king was sending her north. And her brother was trying to sell it that it was in her interests. Damn it, she wished she had found more of his silver to steal. "Is that not so?" Utid pressed. Osrith glared at him, wishing she had not had to place Buey and tagged Sikhs into Steeper's temporary safekeeping, for, brother or no, she would have run him through right there. "Lady," Osrith dragged her eyes from Utid of Bibbenberg to Lady Ellsworth, folding a leg behind the other, and dipping as she might to a queen. "I do confide that I will seek to honor the kingdom of your birth where I have lacked in doing so for Wessex." With not a little satisfaction, she saw muscles by the king's mouth twitch, and she knew that the reason he had told her was not the reason she was being dismissed. Alfred called it transferred. But, she had made an enemy of Ethelwold, and that made her a liability, and a potential danger to their son. Instead, Osrith bowed her head to the Lady Ellsworth, and then to the king, refusing to make eye contact with her brother. Perhaps she could go back to Domhnall. If she did so, it would be overland, and she would have to travel north, and through Mercia, in any case. But, she had heard, London was under attack, and, as London was Mercian, Warriors would be needed. She had a sword and an arm and a body. And with her bag of silver became a warrior. When she was walked from the throne room, shoulder to shoulder with Steeper, they walked back to the armory and gave her back her weaponry. I told them you deserved a place. I wished to keep you here. Osrith stopped. Really? Steeper had vouched for her? After raging at her sex. But, he nodded. You are single-minded and ferocious, he continued. You are an asset to any army. Osrith thought that what Steeper had just said were the most words she had ever heard him speak together. I wish it too. But the king has ordered me to join his ally, Mercia, she said aloud. It didn't sound too bad, to anyone who took it at face value. Stay, at least until tonight, Steeper pressed, his face looking strange. I will be walking with you to the edge of the city. And she remembered what she had half heard Elfrith, who told her so many things, had once told her, that Steeper was, without putting too fine a point on it, with the same tastes as King Domhnall with Finolai. She smiled, despite her despondency. Had he really taken her to be a boy? Do you have armor in need of polishing? Osrith offered. In fact, I do, he said, and for once, Osrith didn't grumble about doing it. Her feet were her memory that night as she paced along to the Etheling's room. The guard was outside, one of Steeper's men, a middle-aged West Saxon, who was snoring heavily over his spear. Anyone who wanted to kill the Etheling that night would have found they had it very easy. She stepped over his prone body and turned the latch, pushing the door open. Osrith. SHH. She insisted, as Edward, not a child to remain in bed and settle down at a disturbance, bounded over to her. I heard you were going with the Mersons. In the candle light, Osrith could see his face, usually sunny and happy, fallen and unhappy. I saved you, or what I thought was you, she said, flopping down next to him. And I was foolish. I should have thought I could not do it alone. Your father has done this for your benefit. You do not need a guard who is foolhardy. But you're not. Edward insisted. Father is just mindful of my cousin. He is missing Ethelflaed and he knows that the east of his kingdom is threatened. He wants me to be the best I can be, and, Osrith nodded, taking his hand and patting it. As I told you, you have to beat me, and you have done that many times in our battles recently. He had grown taller, Osrith now noticed, and filled out a little. His childhood was slipping from him and his maturity was replacing it. Physically, that is, emotionally, not so, for he drew his knees to his chest and bent his head, his hand dragging out of hers. I have served my usefulness, and I will miss you too, Edward. But her sentence was not the finality that Osrith expected it to be. She jumped up, suddenly, as Edward crossed before her, and pressed silver into her hand, and Osrith knew at once another meaning to him mentioning Ethelwold. Alfred knew of his nephew's harassment of her. She was a woman, and it was not something he would do if she was a male guard. That put Edward at risk. She would have done the same, and at a stroke, the grudging resentment she was feeling towards the king of the West Saxons was replaced with renewed respect. You kept this? Edward nodded, and Osrith noticed his demeanor was a little more awkward than she was used to. Thank you. I will miss you, she said, kindly, and was astonished when the young boy came back and Edward jumped at her, hugging her to him, before she stepped out, and back to the armory. 88,888,888. But not. Stepping over the prone guard, snoring heavily, and doing the very opposite of the thing he was meant to be, that is, guarding, Osrith turned instead in the opposite direction, her mind whirled. It was Alfred's scriptorium she went to. If Steeper was expelling her from Wessex, she needed a plan, and one plan may have to include Alba. It did not take her long to discover that Domhnall was still king, that Constantine was with him, and that Alba was strengthening its kingdoms. Unsurprisingly, Domhnall's rogue kingdom was still Strathclyde, but Osrith was astonished to find that Eochaid had died and his son, Dyfnwyl, was now king. If Domhnall had any sense, he will have had this cousin submit to him at Dund, Osrith thought. But she could not go back. Her only thoughts now was that she could head north, to Mercia, to Lord Ethelred, who claimed independence of Alfred, Whatever Alfred thought, he had accession to the army. Miral knew she could fight. At least, if not swim. And her heart beat faster. Osrith's will was to run from the palace now, to find the one person who made her feel good, at Jutad's house. And yet, even now, as she was leaving, Osrith could not find it in herself to go there anyway, and tell him she was his sister. Intrusive thoughts of Constantine invaded her mind, and she went to the door of the scriptorium, locking it behind her, and finding a place where she could sleep. It would be warmer than outside, where the weather had taken on an autumnal feel. Parchments were on the floor, and Osrith found a place in the corner where she could huddle, and she thought about the first time he had made her come. She had discovered how to make it happen herself, as a girl, and had done herself regularly, as she was about to do just now, but Osrith did not realize then it was the same as the riding, grinding feeling of that little knot of flesh right at the top of her cunt. Constantine had not even come the first time, and Osrith had been ignorant too. What had the in and out been for, she had thought then. Osrith knew much better now. Placing a hand between her legs and positioning her breeches so the seam ran in just the right spot, Osrith pulled them up between her legs and pressed down with her hand and, at the same time, crossing her legs at the ankles, an expert move perfected from the first moments, as an 8-year-old girl, when she didn't even know what she was doing, but knew that she wanted to put her hand between her thighs and cross her left leg over her right. It was always after catching sight of one of her uncle's young warriors, who had been about 12 or 13 years old. He never spoke to her. Osrith didn't even know his name, but he would smile, and Edra, as she was, would take herself away, usually down behind the cliffs to a little secluded cave, or up to her bedchamber, even behind the screen in the chapel, and perform this relieving, comforting exercise. She twisted her hips a little into the papers until she had got it just right, and let her mind wander. To loyal Sainid, who had waited for her, who had helped her escape. An older man. What would sex with him have been like? Osrith shifted her bum so she could take advantage of the pressure as she thought of the head of Domhnall's household guard, hands on her, loving, protective. And then there was Tagged, who had chanced upon her as she washed one morning. His eyes had lingered just a fraction of a second too long. Osrith pushed her hand up under her bindings, taking her nipple between thumb and forefinger, while bearing down onto her trousers. She had known then of his thoughts. What would his touch have been like? Her husband. Tagged had told her he loved her. Now, if he had lived and not died rescuing innocents, they should be together, married properly. They could have been together whenever they liked. He could have done this to her, she thought, pressing her digits together and rolling her nipple, her back arching in pleasure. Would the Doyman have been gentle, and treated her softly? Or, would he have held on to her breasts while bucking her from behind as she had seen him do to the servant at Tara at the time of the Uineal festival, when he thought he had been hidden and had been turned away by Gormaliath? The same move Domhnall had used on Finolai on the most holy island of Iona? Or would Tagged have been fitful, mighty, as he had been with himself in that same stable? Osrith adjusted her rhythm again as the pleasure from her own fingers had begun to build up tension around her hips as she rode against her breeches as she might ride a horse, not how she rode a horse. She was dreadful at that, rhythmically. Grind. 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 Listening to her body as her nerves built their pressure. Domhnall. His face appeared in her mind as it sought again the memory of Constantine. He had nearly humped her, unwillingly, at Dara. There had been so many times Osrith had wanted to tell him to kiss her, to touch her here. There. To lie with her. To take her back to Irian. She never had taken it further, though, and neither had Domhnall. What would he have been like in her? In same way that they talked to one another, for friendship? Should they have humped one another for relief? For comfort? As she picked up speed, friction rubbing at her thighs, her labia, her vulva, giving a satisfying tension, another face melted into focus and was with her. Osrith imagined his body in place of her hand and breeches, touching her skin, feeling her, and she him, her dampness now being the dampness that eased his cock into her, thrusting his own rhythm. Finan. Osrith pulled harder, riding her clothing up, as hard as she could against her clit, not caring that tomorrow she would need to bathe her chafed flesh with terebinth. Passion now turned to anger as a rapist was now entering her body. Ethelwold. He had wanted to do this to her, and she could see behind his eyes he was scheming to trick her, to trap her. And further up, pressing her thumb knuckle into her nerve-filled knob as firmly as she could until, rotating it a little with a rhythm that she accelerated until finally, pleasure radiated out from her the bump of flesh, across her chest, and she panted to a stop as more waves, each less powerful than the last, overcame her. He would have held her then, Osrith imagined, fine and more, if she had been with him. She speculated, as she came, enjoying her pleasure almost as much as the release of his own, grinding upwards again to accelerate the next waves of sinew-melting orgasm, holding her hips as she thrust onto him. She hated herself for losing her emotions to handsome face, to his sense of humor, to his strength and humility in equal measure. He was the man Domhnall was not, who Constantine never could be. And while she felt she knew him entirely, in reality, Osrith barely knew the man at all. He had spoken, what, a dozen words to her. Drowsiness came next and Osrith closed her eyes. In the morning, she still had her hand between her crossed legs and the memory filtered into her mind of who had brought such desire to her body, and she rode her breeches once again, her body remembering her recent orgasms of the night before, which meant she could frig herself off quickly, before quitting the scriptorium and the crumpled parchments that had been her bed for the night. As she quietly left Winchester, a solitary figure walking north, a good deal of silver in her possession and in pursuit of the Mercen Guard, Osrith's heart fixed on what she had told herself she must be like in Wessex, a warrior, in search of wealth. She had wealth, some wealth, and she was on her way to Miral, to gain more. Yet her heart was sore. She had not united with her brother, she had not put her faith in Bocca. She had garnered enemies, as well as friends. But her friends were north, and that was where she was going. As Osrith wetted her feet in the River Avon, she passed out of Wessex and into Mercia, to begin a new life, as their warrior of law Death Leard. Of course, what she hadn't fully appreciated was, that this would include Lady Ethelflaed, as well.